You may be wondering, Noah, why in the world do you have a drywall knife with you today? That's because in this video, I'm going to show you everything that you need to know on how to do drywall and the pitfalls to avoid that I wish I knew when I was first starting out. Let's jump into it. So I'm going to go over this kind of in two sections. Primarily, this is going to be just drywall in general. But also, I realize there are people who are just out there who need to do a drywall patch in their home. And I'm going to go ahead and cover that for them first. So what I do is, if it's like regular drywall, and what I mean by that is that there's two types of drywall. There's a moisture resistant drywall. This is for your kitchen, and this is for your not living room, oh my gosh, your bathroom. This is to code. That's what you need to put in there for highly humid areas, for like your sink or your shower. And then there's regular drywall. This is gonna be your white drywall. Your moisture resistant is gonna be like your blue, your green, and your sometimes purple, depending on the brand or manufacturer. And what I'll do is I will go ahead and take a framing square, and I will find my stud first. So I'll do this by either knocking on the wall, and I'll find where the denser sound is, and I'll usually take my measuring tape and I'll split the difference where I think it is. I'll take my measuring tape and I will go 16 inches over, and I'll verify by knocking on it to find my next stud over. You can also use like a stud finder if you want to, or a magnet to find the screw holes. But knocking on the wall is always how I've done it. And I'll kind of make myself a square with my framing square. I'll draw out a square with my framing square. And I'll take what's called an oscillator. Oscillators are really handy for doing drywall work, especially if you're doing like outlets and stuff like that, and you're having to cut out for them. It's basically a buzz tool with fine teeth on the end of it, so it cuts the drywall really easy. And I will go ahead and buzz out that square. After I've removed everything, and if there's any nails or screws, I'll take those out that I can see on my studs. And I will go ahead and measure and start cutting for a new square. You can buy small squares at Lowe's or Home Depot, or you can do a whole sheet depending on how much you got. But cutting drywall is super easy. It's a lot easier than cutting wood or anything like that. All you got to do is take a utility knife and a T-square or a framing square or a level, anything like that. And you make your measurements, mark it out, and then you score it with that utility knife. Drywall is made of gypsum, and it basically has two pieces of paper holding it together. So once you make a score on one side, you're able to actually pop it. And I'll do this with my knee or something like that if it's a big piece. And it actually creates a crevice on the backside once you fold it back, that you can make a square. You can score your next cut, and that just cuts the pieces of paper. So you do that twice to make sure you get a good square. And basically what I'll do is I'll pop it in place, and I'll put a few drywall screws around it. This is going to be like 1.25 to 1.5 drywall screws. And I'll just basically sink them in there with my impact driver. Not so, like, be very gentle with it, because you don't want to actually go through the drywall, because then it won't actually hold it in there anymore. You just want to make sure that the head is not protruding from the drywall, so that way whenever you do mud it, you don't have to go back later and force it in a little bit more. And what I'll do next is I will get drywall tape. If you've ever seen older houses, they'll use they used a lot of drywall tape back then. Sorry, paper tape. Paper tape is not something you want to use. It does not hold up well against the test of time. If you see those older houses now, they'll have cracks in them, or you'll see the paper tape starting to protrude or to start to come out, and it's because it didn't have a great bond. So what I like to use is basically this plastic mesh tape, and I don't know if it's like fiberglass or not, but you just cut it with your utility knife or your drywall blade. Drywall knife is why it's called a knife. You can actually just hold the tape and just tear it, and you basically apply it on your seams. So it's going to be a regular square, I'm sure, and that's about it. And what you're going to want to get next is all joint compounds. This is going to be your mud. Typically, if it's a small patch, they sell quart containers or even gallon containers. Gallons are really good to use, but they also sell in 5-gallon buckets if you're doing like a whole bunch of patchwork. So I'll get that, and I'll tell you with your knife. So you don't have to get a 12-inch knife. This is a 12-inch knife. If you're doing like a whole house or you're doing walls or anything like that, like a brand new wall that you just drywalled, I would recommend getting a 12-inch knife. But if you're getting just a small patch job, then a 6-inch knife would be plenty for you. The problem, what most people make, especially in bigger builds or anything bigger than a small patch job, they really get into putting in too much mud on their wall. And you might be wondering, well, how do I know how much mud I need to put on my wall? Well, you're going to be doing 3 coats, and what I'll do is I like to use the term a little bit goes a long way with drywall. Whenever I'm teaching people, I'll tell them just put on a light amount, because you're going to be building up layers, and you just want enough so that way it covers the tape. It covers your drywall tape. And that way, whenever you go to sand, you don't have a massive amount of material to take off. That's really what bites people in the butt when doing drywall, is they'll put a whole bunch on there. They'll just smear it on there, and the next person has to come by and sand it all off, and it gets messy real quick. If you're doing a small, okay, let me backtrack a little bit. So for your 3 coats, you're basically going to be, your first pass is going to be around 6 inches wide for how much mud you're putting on. And that's not even going to cover all the tape. And then when you come by to do your second pass, you're going to let that dry. You're going to come by and do your second pass, and it's going to be probably about 12 inches wide. If you're doing a small patch, then you're just going to be smearing in a circle. And you'll basically, on your third pass, you're going to make sure it's pretty big, actually. It's going to be like probably 1.5 to 2 feet. I mean, just a big circle that you're going to just feather in, because you want it to kind of fade out so it's not noticeable. It doesn't stand out so much. But remember, you're just doing pretty much a skim coat at that point. During your second and third pass, you're just basically doing a skim coat. And after you do that and you're getting ready to sand, you basically have 2 options. One, you can either wet sand, which is actually, I really do recommend wet sanding for small patch jobs. There's instructions on the bucket and on your drywall bucket, and it'll tell you what to do. But basically, all it is that you get a damp sponge. And I did this for our house. I took a little bucket of water around with me, and I just dampened my sponge in there, and I just kind of moved the material around with it. I didn't make it so that it was that the sponge was actually dripping. I just made it so it was just damp. And you're actually able to fill in holes. You're actually able to sand down any hills and actually move some of that material into some valleys if you have them. I like to say whenever you're doing a drywall, like a pass or a coat, you basically, outside of your first coat, you don't really need to worry about this, but like your second and third coat, I like to make it so that way you have that it looks like a finished product, because that really eliminates a lot of the sanding. This is from patchwork all the way to, for a full wall or house. I like to make sure it has a good finish and that there's no streaks or any of that, what we call trash, any of that dried drywall crumbles that you're smearing in there or you're skimming in there. You really want to try to pick that out if you can. But the cool thing about drywall is that if you're not happy with the end product of your coat, you can always skim it off and try again. So I'm going to get into more about how you would do a whole house in this, or a wall in general. And basically, you'll notice that when you go to buy sheetrock, it's going to be in a 4x8 foot sheet. They come in 12-foot sheets and also 16-foot sheets, but 8-foot sheets are more common and they're a lot easier to carry. And typically, I think it's going to be about 1/2 inch for the thickness. But the reason why it's 8 foot long is so that way your studs are going to be 16 inch on center. Sometimes they're 24 depending on how your house was built, but typically they're going to be 16s. And they're spaced out enough so that way your full sheet of sheetrock will always land on the center of the stud. So that way they have proper spacing. If I'm doing like a new house and I know we're going to put LVP or snap lock flooring in there, because snap lock flooring is actually a floating floor, and I'll put 1/2 inch spacers underneath where I'm about to lay my drywall up against the studs. I'll put 2 1/2 inch spacers underneath there. That could be like plywood or whatever. That gives me room, so that way I can later on put my flooring underneath there to give it enough room to wiggle around, because it will move. And I'll basically, after I'm done with sheetrock and everything, I'll paint it, of course, and then I'll just put my base molding and I'll cover that gap. So that way it does have room to breathe, per se. So when I line up my sheetrock and I have it measured and cut and it's center of my studs, I will take my drywall screws and I'll do 5 screws per stud. So like say for one sheet of sheetrock, that's 5 screws per stud. And I will go the top of the sheet and then the bottom of the sheet, middle, and then split the difference on the other two. What I'll also do is I'll take my T-square. This is really helpful, and I would really recommend getting this tool if you have a lot of sheetrock to do. And you could get this at Harbor Freight for like super cheap. And I will basically take my I'll take my T-square and my utility knife and I will just score down the side of it, pop it like I said before, and score the other side. That way I have my even cuts for my sheetrock. So after that, I'll do my drywall tape just like before, and I'll start mudding. Now, when I'm doing regular seams, I'll make sure that my and it's about the same thing. It's about the same principle as doing a patch job. My first pass will be about 6 inches. My second pass will be about a trowel and a half. That's going to be around 18 inches. And then my third pass will be about 2.5 trowels. So that's going to be, 2.5 feet. And so what I do with my trowels, this is a really handy tip that I wish I knew at the beginning, is that my trowel has this bevel in it. Now, I made this bevel in it because usually trowels are machined so that they're straight. But I put a little bevel in mine just by putting pressure in the center with my thumbs and bending out. So it has this little cup with it. This is really, I would not do drywall without having a trowel that had a cup in it. The reason being is because when you apply pressure, and applying pressure is so, it is really an art when you're doing drywall, because it makes such a big difference, the amount of pressure that you apply. But I'll use the cup side for my seams. This kind of fades out the, so if you could almost imagine, it fades out the mud. But the back side, which has the, not the lip, but it is the opposite side of the cup, the curve. I use it for skim coats. And once you get to like your second or third pass, you'll be using a lot of this side. And I'll basically just lightly apply pressure with my finger. Sometimes it's firmly if the mud's already, if it's just like a skim coat and it's not a whole lot of material, I'll skim it with the backside. This is this is one of the best ways I know of doing drywall. What a lot of people do, a lot of the older guys, they will clip the corners of their trowel. That way they don't have streaks going in, because when you're working with wet mud, especially on like the second coat or even the first, you really do run into trouble with sometimes making streaks in it, and that can be done over later. You know, I always after a coat has dried, I'll take the back side of my trowel and I'll just kind of scuff over any hills that are in there. And another thing is, whenever you go to do your corners, they make a special trowel for it. It's called a corner trowel. I know. And I don't really like them. I mean, just to be honest with you, I don't really like them. You can experiment with them if you want, but I've always just used a 12-inch trowel. Because I'm always having to go over it again after I apply mud in the corner, and I make streaks in it, and I usually have to use the backside of my trowel and just feather it out. So I just do it with this anyways. I just pack mud in there and I fan it out. You'll notice that your corners of your when you're doing drywall, your corners of your wall are going to stay wet the longest, opposed to your seams. So there's a couple ways you can get around this. You can buy a drying compound. I've actually never used these before. I've always just let them wait for 10 hours or something like that. And the way you know that drywall is dry is when you don't see the discoloration, because it'll be a darker gray. And you really want to stay away from putting fresh mud over previously not dried mud yet. Mud that's already that's still wet, hasn't fully cured. Because what this will do is that it'll cause cracks in there. It'll cause cracks from the moisture just drying up, and your mud drying up, and that's what creates cracks, and you really don't want that. So always make sure that your mud is dry before you go on to the next coat. And the same thing with sanding. You can do wet sanding for a wall or a whole house. And I would probably do that more so than other methods, because they also make scrub brushes that you can put your sandpaper on a paint pole and do it the manual way. I would almost do a wet sanding before I would do that. They also do sell 9-inch orbital drywall sanders. This is at Harbor Freight. That might be something worth investing in if you're doing a whole house. And what I'll do is, after I've sanded and everything, I will basically go over everything with a fine tip cone, because you really want good lighting when you're doing drywall, because you'd be surprised how much can hide in the white corners, or just in the plain in sight places after you're done sanding. So what I'll do is I'll take a flashlight, whether it be my phone or just a regular flashlight, and I'll go over everything, and I'll take a pencil with me, and I'll mark out any imperfections that need to be corrected later on. And that's what I'll do. I'll just take the backside of my trowel, and I'll just apply mud in there, do a very small amount, or just things that need to be sanded later, or things that need to be sanded before painting. If you're doing your screw holes, so when you're doing your screw holes, I like using a 6-inch trowel for this, but it's doable with 12-inch. Basically, you're going to be taking just a lump of mud, not very much, and you're going to just apply pressure to where your screw hole is, and then I'll cross over it again. I'm making an X pretty much, and that forces the mud into the hole, and it wipes off the excess. You're going to want to do that. You're going to want to do that 3 times as well. You're basically only trying to get enough mud on there so that way it just fills the hole. Not that you're trying to put anything extra on there for later, but that's pretty much how you would do that. I would recommend using like 120 grit, maybe 150 grit for your sandpaper. The reason being is because you don't want a grit that's so low that you start marring up the drywall, because it's super easy to do that. But you also don't want something that's so fine that you're not actually moving any material. So that's really the happy zone of sandpaper for drywall. And that's pretty much it. That's everything I have to say about drywall, and everything I wish I knew at the beginning. If you have anything that you want to see for future content, or have any questions, leave it down in the comments down below. And until next time, I'll see you later.